But the business is, it's your boy 2 a.m. coming at y'all from everywhere but nowhere, somewhere but nowhere, high up in the sky. Y'all, I'm kind of lost, but guess what? Found y'all. I'm with y'all. We together. We finna vibe and watch some stuff. Right. Um, we finna talk about this Venezuela stuff. Yeah. Trump took it over. They had this plans in the works for years. It was just the opportune moment. So they said seize the moment. Carpe diem. Let's get into it.
The world's largest oil reserves, sitting in a country where 30% of the population has already fled, Russian and Iranian weapons flowing in. And in August, for the first time since the 1980s, the US has assembled a massive naval strike force just miles from Venezuela's coast. 8 warships, a nuclear submarine, over 4,000 Marines. Officially, it's about drugs and refugees. But here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Washington may actually be preparing to invade. Why now? Today, we're unpacking the hidden evidence.
By the way, this video is 4 weeks ago. So whoever made this, they planned this. Well, they kind of, they saw this happening before it happened. It was kind of crazy. Caught it weeks before. But if you know, I guess if you know, you know. You know. But let's get into it.
From collapsing oil pipelines to China's secret deals to the quiet troop buildups that prove why the US might be closer than ever to war in its own backyard. Today's crisis didn't appear overnight. It's been decades in the making. And to really understand why Venezuela and America are now on the edge of open conflict, we need to rewind. It all started in 1999 when Hugo Chavez stormed into power promising to defy the United States. By 2002, the relationship had already collapsed. The CIA even backed a coup that briefly removed Chavez from office, a warning that U.S. intervention in Venezuela wasn't a conspiracy theory, but a reality that would haunt the next 20 years. Chavez built his entire image around defying Washington, constantly painting the U.S. as an imperialist enemy. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, doubled down on that message, turning being anti-American into Venezuela's official brand. The result? A spiral of retaliation. Venezuela seized oil fields, the U.S. hit back with rising sanctions, and the 2000s turned into a slow-motion collision course that was bound to explode sooner or later. By the mid-2000s, Washington had Venezuela in its crosshairs. First came the labels, failing counter-narcotics partner. Then came the sanctions, targeting officials and allies of Hugo Chavez. But things escalated under Maduro. In 2019, the U.S. made a move straight out of a spy novel. It declared opposition leader Juan Guaido the real president of Venezuela and openly backed an attempted coup. The plan failed, but the message was clear. Every crisis, every sanction was dressed up as democracy promotion or drug control. But behind the curtain, it was always the same 3 motives: oil, power, and blocking Russia, China, and Iran from gaining a foothold in America's backyard. By 2025, Maduro had forced his way into a 3rd term after a blatantly rigged election that saw thousands of opponents thrown in jail. The world condemned it, but Maduro didn't care. Now, Venezuela was completely isolated. No diplomatic ties left, no trust on either side. And that's when the real danger set in. Every supply ship, every military advisor, every frozen bank account turned into a potential spark. The entire US-Venezuela relationship had become a high-stakes chess match. And one wrong move could set off open conflict. And then there's the oil. On paper, Venezuela should be filthy rich. It sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, over 300 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. In the 1990s, it pumped over 3 million barrels a day, with nearly 2 million flowing straight to the US. But today, the oil giant has collapsed to less than 20% of its peak. And here's the bizarre part. Venezuela's oil is so thick it can't even flow through pipelines without being mixed with lighter fuels. So the country that has more oil than anyone else has to import fuel from Iran just to move its own crude. The system is falling apart. Over 25 pipelines, some more than
You gotta make a business. Something like that happens, then you have to figure out third party to come in. And people were so concerned about getting the money and getting everything like that, they didn't figure that out. And that's why they're in the position they are.
Than 50 years old are leaking and breaking like arteries in a dying body. Oil spills, blackouts, and plants running at less than 10% capacity are now routine. Fixing it would take $58 billion just to get back to 1990s levels. And when Caracas tried to pivot to natural gas, that hope collapsed too. The Dragon Field, a $35 billion project that could have supplied Trinidad, was abruptly cut off when Washington pulled Shell and BP's licenses in 2025. It was a clear message. The US isn't just squeezing Maduro, it's trying to choke Venezuela's energy lifeline completely. But here's the devastating irony. Venezuela's oil collapse isn't just broken pipelines, it's a death spiral. Every failure means less money. Less money means no repairs. And no repairs means even bigger failures. In the late 1990s, state oil company PDVSA had over 40,000 trained engineers. Today, fewer than 12,000 remain, and many of them lack the expertise to run the world's heaviest crude. The real talent has fled to Canada, Colombia, and Texas, taking decades of irreplaceable knowledge with them. What's left is a nightmare. Soviet-era machines that break down weekly, workers forced to patch leaks with improvised fixes that would horrify any safety inspector. Venezuela still sits on the biggest oil reserves on Earth, but it's become a country that literally can't extract, refine, or export its own resources. A so-called oil superpower that can't even power itself. The collapse of Venezuela's oil sector unleashed something almost unheard of outside of wartime, an economy in free fall. The numbers are staggering. Just 2 decades ago, Venezuela's GDP sat around $300 billion. By 2025, barely $110 billion. A collapse on par with the Great Depression. And inflation? At one point, it wasn't just high, it was absurd. Prices spiraled so fast that annual inflation hit over 1 million %. People carried stacks of cash that couldn't even buy a loaf of bread.
Damn, that's crazy.
By 2024, it cooled to around 48%, but forecasters already expect it to rocket back toward 200% in 2025.
I want to add some guitar.
Do you know how to make music?
No, of course not.
Okay. What's up, guys? We're here at the airport in Madrid.
The currency tells the story better than anything. 10 years ago, one US dollar cost 6 bolivars. By the end of 2024, 52. And on the street where most Venezuelans actually trade, the dollar is already worth closer to 95. The government's solution? Print bigger bills. New 200 and 500 bolivar notes, even digital money experiments. But none of it matters because the dollar has become the only real currency Venezuelans can trust. And when it comes to the social impact, it is staggering beyond comprehension. Food, medicine, even electricity, things most countries take for granted, are now scarce. By 2023, surveys showed that 82% of Venezuelans were worried about running out of food. Almost half the country faced moderate to severe hunger. The poverty line? Officially over 50%. Independent estimates put it closer to 70%. 7 out of 10 people trapped in poverty in what was once South America's richest nation. But the most shocking figure is this. Nearly 1 in 3 Venezuelans have fled the country. As of mid-2025, the UN counts 7.9 million Venezuelans living abroad, the second largest refugee crisis in the world after Syria. That's a human tide bigger than the population of Switzerland.
7.9 million? You know how many people that is?
On the move, Colombia alone now hosts 2.5 million refugees. Peru, almost 2 million. Millions more are scattered across Brazil, the Caribbean, and even making the dangerous trek north to the US border. And here's the cruel twist. While Venezuela's economy imploded at home, its refugee crisis exploded abroad, destabilizing entire regions and even reshaping American politics. The human tide has become so overwhelming that in 2020.
So I want to ask a question to people watching this video with me. With you seeing this and seeing, I guess, how they're living life and what everything that they have to go through, are you more acceptable for them coming over here? Question.
2023, the U.S. announced plans to revoke temporary protected status for over 300,000 Venezuelan migrants. This came into effect in April 2025 and sparked fears of potentially forcing mass deportations back to a country in freefall. So these were homegrown challenges and consequences. But what was happening worldwide, particularly with alliances? As Venezuela's economy collapsed, Maduro reached out for lifelines. But the countries answering his calls weren't friends of Washington. Russia, China, and Iran all stepped in, seizing the chance to turn Venezuela into a strategic outpost in America's backyard. And then came the moment that sent shockwaves through Western intelligence. In May 2025, Maduro stood in Moscow and signed a sweeping 10-year strategic partnership with Russia. It covered everything: energy, financial aid, advanced technology, and most alarmingly, military cooperation. Venezuela's own foreign minister bragged it was the first time in history a Latin American nation had signed a deal of this scale with Russia. State TV hammered the point home: military ties were now a top priority. To U.S. analysts, this wasn't just a desperate move by a crumbling regime. It was the opening chapter of a proxy war in the Western Hemisphere. First, Russia. Moscow quietly shipped spare parts to keep Venezuela's aging fleet of Soviet-era fighter jets flying and began upgrading its air defenses. Intelligence sources now say Russian military advisors are embedded on the ground, with even joint weapons factories under discussion. Next, China. Beijing reopened crucial oil credit lines, giving Maduro access to hard currency he desperately needed. In spring 2025, Venezuela's vice president flew to Beijing to negotiate sweeping new oil deals with China's state giant CNPC. At the UN, China has shielded Maduro again and again, vetoing resolutions, while at the same time pouring money into infrastructure projects designed to lock up Venezuelan resources for decades. But perhaps the most combustible partner of all is Iran. Since 2021, Tehran has supplied refinery technology, signed nearly $500 million in contracts, and even helped overhaul Venezuela's largest refineries. At one point, the two countries struck a bizarre 2-to-1 oil swap deal. Venezuela shipped out 2 barrels of crude for every single barrel of refined product Iran sent back. The deal collapsed when Caracas couldn't meet quotas, leaving Venezuela even more desperate for Iranian support. And now, alarmingly, intelligence reports say Iranian drones, anti-ship missiles, and small naval vessels have already made their way into Venezuela's arsenal. Add to this the thousands of Cuban security advisors still embedded in the government, plus Colombian guerrilla groups and narco cartels who operate freely across the border. The result? Venezuela is no longer just a failing state. It's becoming a forward operating base for America's enemies, right in the US's own hemisphere. But what does President Donald Trump have to say about all this? When he returned to the White House in January 2025, Washington wasted no time tightening the screws. Oil waivers were scrapped, Chevron's license gone, Venezuela's last reliable revenue streams cut off overnight. But the real shock came on July 25th, 2025. For the first time in American history, the U.S. Treasury labeled an entire foreign military leadership, Venezuela's so-called Cartel de los Sols, as a global terrorist organization. Every asset frozen, every bank transfer criminalized. No military in the world had ever been hit with that label before. At the same time, Trump doubled the bounty on Nicolas Maduro's head to an outrageous $50 million, while quietly ordering the Pentagon to prepare military options. By late August, those options suddenly looked real. A U.S. naval strike group, 7 warships, and a nuclear submarine moved into the southern Caribbean. It was the largest American show of force in the region since the 1980s. The lineup was no token patrol, 3 Aegis destroyers, a guided missile cruiser, and the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, carrying 4,500 troops, including 2,200 Marines with helicopters and amphibious vehicles. Enough firepower to seize beaches, neutralize air defenses, and topple a government in days. On paper, Washington still insisted this was about drugs and refugees. But the buildup sent a louder message. This looked less like policing cartels and more like preparing for war. By the start of September, the stage was set for a showdown the Western Hemisphere hasn't seen in decades. U.S. officials kept repeating there would be no boots on the ground, but behind the scenes, they were quietly stockpiling multiple invasion blueprints. The naval strike group offshore was overwhelming. The USS Iwo Jima carried an entire military expeditionary unit, complete with attack helicopters and again amphibious vehicles. Essentially, a floating invasion force. The Aegis destroyers alongside it? they could wipe out Venezuela's air defense in hours. Caracas knew what this meant. Satellite images released by Venezuela itself showed frantic preparations. New defense corridors carved around oil facilities, coastal radar systems reinforced, and dozens of small gunboats patrolling the shoreline. And then came the most serious move yet. President Maduro personally toured border states, deploying 15,000 troops to Colombia's frontier. At a September press conference, Maduro delivered his most defiant warning yet. He claimed the U.S. had positioned 8 warships, a submarine, and over 1,200 missiles within striking distance of Venezuela. Whether or not his numbers were exaggerated, one thing was clear. Caracas believed an invasion was no longer speculation. It was imminent. Maduro vowed that if American forces crossed the line, Venezuela would unleash a republic in arms. That meant mobilizing not just the army, but millions of civilians for guerrilla warfare. In his words, the entire population would become a battlefield. And what was offshore was no bluff. The amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, as we said, carried a full Marine expeditionary unit. But it was officially on hurricane watch duty. Just behind it, the nuclear submarine USS Newport News lurked as a silent deterrent to any Russian or Chinese response. The message from both sides could not have been more obvious. Venezuela was preparing to fight for survival, while Washington had assembled the tools to take it down in days. Most telling, the guided missile cruiser USS Lake Erie transited the Panama Canal on August 29th, specifically to join the Caribbean Task Force, an asset typically reserved for high-intensity conflicts, requiring advanced air defense capabilities. Pentagon sources privately acknowledge this represents the largest U.S. naval concentration in Caribbean waters since the 1980s interventions in Grenada and Panama. Roughly 4,500 American personnel, including elite Marines and naval aviators, now operate within hours of Venezuelan territory while conducting increasingly aggressive training exercises with Caribbean partners. So hopefully we've painted a big enough picture of what's happening right now. But there are some crazy facts that can't be skipped over here. Ones that explain just why Venezuela has become such a volatile flashpoint. Venezuela sits on 304 billion barrels of proven crude, 18% more than Saudi Arabia. Yet it produces less than 10% of its historic peak. Why? Because the oil is so dense and sulfurous that pulling it out of the ground often costs more than it can be sold for. It's the paradox of the world's richest reserves trapped in a country that can't afford to use them. The result has been catastrophic.
Listen, it's called Connect Team, and it's insane. I don't do schedules or timesheets manually anymore.
And it worked.
Between 2013 and 2025, Venezuela's economy shrank by roughly 75%, one of the worst peacetime collapses in modern history. The bolivar has been redenominated 3 times, and black market rates hover near 95 per dollar as Caracas desperately pushes digital payments and cryptocurrency just to keep basic trade alive. Meanwhile, the physical backbone of the country is falling apart. Oil pipelines rupture daily. The Paraguana refinery complex limps along at less than 15% capacity. And Washington's 2025 decision to brand the Venezuelan military a terrorist organization marked the first time in U.S. history an entire armed force was criminalized under anti-terror laws. Add to this the foreign presence, an estimated 100 to 200 Russian military advisors, over 2,000 Cuban security personnel, and dozens of Iranian technicians now operate openly inside Venezuela. Joint naval drills in the Caribbean have become so routine that Pentagon officials describe the country as a forward operating base for hostile powers right in America's backyard. By mid-2025, the situation had crossed the threshold. What began as economic warfare was rapidly transforming into military posturing. And to understand how it escalated this far, we need to break it down step by step. January to March 2025, devastating sanctions cut off Venezuela's last viable avenues for oil exports, and Maduro's phony inauguration led to total diplomatic isolation. Venezuela lost an estimated $200 million a month in revenue as a result of the termination of Chevron's license alone. April to June 2025, the Dragon gas pipeline cancellation destroyed Venezuela's most promising energy diversification project, while Chinese and Russian support agreements accelerated, creating a bipolar competition for influence over Venezuelan resources. July 2025, according to Caracas, the branding of Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization went too far, effectively criminalizing the whole Venezuelan military, while Trump's approval of anti-cartel military operations hinted at the possibility of armed involvement. August 2025, while Maduro responded with enormous militia mobilization and preparations for coastal defense, military positioning became clear as the largest U.S. naval task group in decades gathered in Venezuelan waters. September 2025, with both sides now publicly prepared for a possible armed conflict while international mediation attempts remained deadlocked, Maduro's Republic in Arms declaration marked a clear escalation to war posture. What makes this standoff even more dangerous isn't just the weapons or the sanctions. It's the tempo. Each round of escalation now triggers a faster and sharper response, shrinking the window for diplomacy and magnifying the risk of miscalculation. It's a dynamic that feels ripped straight out of the Cold War. Economic strangulation, proxy maneuvers, and military posturing stacked layer by layer until both sides stand on the edge of a direct clash. One wrong move, a misread radar ping, a skirmish at sea, a single misfire could be enough to tip this from brinkmanship into open conflict. But there's still more to explore. Questions that nobody is answering, but should. Behind the official narratives of drug interdiction and migration control lie far more uncomfortable strategic questions that reveal the true complexities of the crisis. If narcotics enforcement were genuinely the primary objective, why deploy amphibious assault capabilities and 4,500 Marines rather than focus on intelligence sharing with Colombia and traditional anti-narcotics cooperation? The naval buildup suggests objectives far beyond counter-drug operations, with historical parallels to preemptive interventions in Panama 1989 and Iraq 2003 that officially targeted criminal networks but ultimately achieved regime change. Even more critically, how would Russia and China respond to direct military action against their strategic partner? Would Beijing or Moscow risk confrontation over Venezuela, or limit themselves to arms supplies for any resistance movement? Without UN Security Council authorization, unilateral US action would face condemnation as illegal aggression, forcing Washington to construct some NATO-style collective defense argument based on terrorism threats. Elsewhere, Brazil has openly opposed any intervention, and Mexico has explicitly rejected U.S. military transit rights, raising questions about whether regional diplomatic efforts can effectively prevent escalation. At the same time, some Caribbean nations might actually support limited actions, potentially to help stem the massive refugee flows. That could influence the broader regional dynamics surrounding the situation. Likely the most puzzling is whether Washington expects economic pressure to trigger internal revolt, making invasion unnecessary through a color revolution scenario, or if the Pentagon has realistic occupation plans for governing a hostile population of 26 million across mountainous terrain that extends far beyond easily secured oil facilities and urban centers. Now, looking at the evidence, the argument that the US is actively preparing for potential invasion of Venezuela sits on compelling motive meeting unprecedented opportunity. Venezuela's economic collapse has transformed it from a regional power into a destabilizing burden, while creating a strategic opening for hostile powers seeking Western Hemisphere influence. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, eliminating oil revenues, criminalizing military leadership, and assembling overwhelming naval forces, suggests they view Maduro's removal as a necessary strategic objective, with drug interdiction narratives providing political cover for contingency planning far beyond conventional law enforcement. So yes, because Venezuela has the greatest oil reserves in the world, a severe refugee crisis, and fierce great power competition, the United States has a strong incentive to destabilize the country while also gathering the resources to do it. The United States is systematically prepared to put pressure on the regime to fall through the use of naval task groups, terrorist designations, and comprehensive sanctions. This strategy is an example of a well-known pattern, using military positioning and economic strangulation to overthrow an adversarial government without resorting to open invasion or admitting its consequences. However, the risks remain enormous. Potential casualties, international condemnation, guerrilla warfare, and possible great power confrontation, while benefits remain uncertain given Venezuela's devastation. But why now specifically? Because the perceived costs of inaction, ongoing mass migration, accelerating Chinese and Russian penetration, unchecked narcotics trafficking, and potential state collapse have reached a threshold where Washington apparently considers confrontation preferable to the status quo. Whether or not the US ultimately acts, the trajectory is unmistakable. Invasion has evolved from speculation to realistic contingency planning. Right now, the standoff is expected to continue as US forces maintain their Caribbean presence, while Maduro strengthens Venezuela's coastal defenses and militia networks. Diplomatic engagement through the UN in coordination with regional allies, particularly Colombia, may influence whether this crisis escalates toward direct military confrontation or finds some negotiated resolution. Simply put, with both sides now positioned for potential conflict, the haunting question of why America might invade Venezuela next no longer.
Well, we obviously know what happened. Trump went in and got that bitch. He said, nope. 2 seconds. They was in there 30 minutes. They didn't even know they was there. Y'all let me know what y'all think about this. Now that we know about it, and more you know, the more you can grow. And the more you have information, the more you're not ignorant. I like to just get information and just get information because it's important. Information is important. You know what I'm talking about? Hey, appreciate y'all. Till the next time, peace and love. Let's go.